Segue, to continue at once with the next musical selection or composition.
Segue, to make a transition directly from one section or theme to another.
Segue, to move smoothly and unhesitatingly from one state, situation, condition, or element to another.
Segue, to perform in the manner of the preceding section.
Segue, to make a transition from one thing to another smoothly and without interruption.
This is Segue with Dean Aldemaro Romero, a weekly program exploring the lives and work of the people of the College of Arts and Sciences at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville.
Hello everybody. Dr. Trisha Brooks was born in Allentown, Pennsylvania. She obtained her bachelor's degree in English at Orsino's College in Pennsylvania, a master's in divinity from Harvard, another master's, this time in arts, as well as her doctorate from Tufts University in Massachusetts. Today, she is an assistant professor in the Department of English Language and Literature at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. Welcome to Segue, Dr. Brooks.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
You have an interesting background because all of your degrees are in English, except the one in divinity. So tell us a little bit about that, I would say, divergence in your academic career and divinity versus English.
Well, when I was at Ursinus College, that is a liberal arts school, so I had the opportunity to explore more than just English, and I discovered I had a real deep love for religion and spirituality, and I saw that reflected in the literature that I was reading in my English classes. So I wanted to see if I could combine those two, and I had a great mentor who suggested that I apply to the Harvard Divinity School.
Okay. So why Harvard? Why that particular divinity school? Because there are many of them in this country.
It's true. Harvard has a great program because they have something called the Masters of Theological Studies, which is completely open, and you can craft your degree to meet your particular needs. So I knew I wanted to take classes in the literature program as well as in religious studies and at the Divinity School, and they allowed me to do that. So that's why I chose them.
And that's regardless of your religious persuasion, right?
That's right.
Okay. Now, how different do you find your experience going from a small liberal arts college to Harvard?
That was a really, really big change, and I think that was the hardest transition to make. I felt like I was really prepared to do the work, but I didn't have the same access to my professors that I had had in undergrad. It was much harder to see them. They're very busy. They have these very tight hours of availability. You get these 15-minute time slots to meet with them. And so that was much harder, realizing I had to be more independent, I think. But, that also helped me to grow as a student and a scholar. And there are other benefits there, like other resources that you can take advantage of. So I did that.
So you do feel that experience was beneficial for your career as a scholar today?
Absolutely. I had access to so many wonderful resources that helped me to grow into the intellectual that I am today. So,
when did you decide to become a college professor? That was after you went to college or some time earlier?
I started out as a pre-med major, but my second semester, freshman year, I took an English class, and I knew I had always loved books and reading and literature, but in that class I got the chance to actually teach a class. That was one of the assignments, to co-teach, and I realized how much I loved it and decided that that's what I needed to do, and so I switched my major to English, and the rest is history.
Okay. Now, a lot of people who we interview in this program who are college professors, they say that somehow they were also influenced for a particular professor when pursuing their teaching career. Was that your case too?
I had a lot of wonderful teachers at Ursinus. The first professor that I took, who had me co-teach a class, she was one. She inspired my love for African American literature, actually. So she's the reason I'm in this particular discipline and specialty. And then I also had a wonderful mentor who was in, religious studies. And he also mentored me as well, and definitely shapes the way I teach, and also my emphasis on wanting to make sure that what students learn is connected to the real world.
Okay. Well, we have talked about African American literature. We have talked about theology, and you have been working on a subject or a person who also combines those areas, which is Amanda Smith. But I'm sure most people haven't heard of her. So can you please explain to our audience who was Amanda Smith?
So Amanda Smith was born into slavery in Maryland and in the 19th century, and she ended up being freed by her owner. And she traveled to the north, lived as a free woman, worked as a washerwoman, and really struggled. And it ended up being her faith and her spiritual experience that helped her to survive slavery and then the experiences of struggling with life in the North. And she felt that she was called to become a preacher and a missionary. And so after her husband died, she ended up traveling abroad. And she actually traveled all over Europe. She traveled to India, and also she spent 8 years in Liberia in Africa as well. And so I chose her as one of the figures to focus on because I was really interested in her travel, because that's not what you typically think of when you think of black women in the 19th century.
Yeah, particularly a freed slave and, pretty much traveling around the world.
Yes.
That's quite unusual.
Yes.
Now, I understand that she is admired not only by black women, but also by white women. Why do you think that's the case?
She had a really strong appeal to white audiences, and I think part of that may have been her sort of conservative way of presenting herself. She really liked the Quakers, and so she sort of influenced how she presented herself physically. So she was sort of a non-threatening figure in that way, I think. I'm still struggling to understand why she was able to keep her audience, because she was so critical of white racism, and I find it really shocking, as critical as she is, that her popularity continued. But she was also really charismatic, and she was known for her singing as well, and so she engaged a lot of audiences that way.
Okay. Now, she participated in a movement that was quite strong at the beginning of the 20th century called the temperance movement. And maybe some people in our audience don't know exactly what was it all about. Can you please summarize for them what the temperance movement was all about?
Well, the idea behind the temperance movement is that to really respond to the suffering that women and children were experiencing in the family as a result of alcoholism. And so the thinking for women social activists was that if they could eliminate alcohol, they could improve family life and women's lives and the lives of children as well. And this was particularly important for many African Americans. In addition to fighting against slavery, they also fought against this as well.
Okay. Now, interesting enough, the temperance movement ended up with prohibition somehow. But then that was reversed when it was found that in many ways prohibition brought a number of other problems that were very serious. So I was wondering if even today, if there is any sense in thinking that by controlling alcohol, you can diminish the effect of alcoholism on families.
Yeah, I think it's a problematic position to take. It doesn't work at the end of the day. At first, it's impossible to really control and to regulate. I think we sort of see that from history, and ultimately, it didn't really enact the change that they were hoping for.
And you probably can make the same case for drugs.
Yes, I make the connection to marijuana and those laws that are changing.
And now that there are more and more states that are pretty much allowing the use of marijuana, whether medical or in very free ways, like Colorado, for example. And now that the federal government is not really pursuing the drug charges in those states, one starts to think, well, maybe we are going the same route, but in a different fashion.
It's possible. It does look very familiar and very similar, yeah.
Okay. Now, you have also worked on what is called the allusions in the Bible of a book titled A Narrative of the Life and Travels of Mrs. Nancy Prince. And here we have another traveling experience with a person called Nancy Prince. Who was Nancy Prince?
Now, Nancy Prince was a free black woman, so she was born in the North, in Massachusetts. She's a really interesting story because she was born to...
in what time are we talking about?
She was born in the early 19th century.
Okay.
She wrote her narrative in 1853. And she was born to parents who survived the Middle Passage, so she had a very direct connection to Africa and was influenced by their experience of slavery. Her stepfather actually escaped from a slave ship. That's how he attained his freedom. But she traveled around the world as well. She traveled to Russia, and that's where she spent a good deal of her life. She moved there and lived there for about 8 years with her husband, who worked in the court of the Russian Tsar. And then after his death, she returned and traveled to Jamaica and as well.
I mean, it sounds easy in today's term, but at that time, to go to Russia and from Russia to Jamaica, we're talking about months of traveling by ship.
Yes.
So it wasn't that easy, and many ships didn't return from those travels. So I was wondering, we have mentioned Nancy Prince here, we have mentioned Amanda Smith, and both are traveling women. What can we learn from the experiences of African American women who made these international travels?
Well, I think what I have learned is that we can't really appreciate their travels unless we consider what motivated them. And for them, they really were motivated by their spiritual experience, but also their lived experience of oppression and suffering. So for Amanda Smith, we learn that black women traveled because they believed that they were called by God to share the gospel. But at the same time, that travel is very much tied in with, imperialism and colonization. And so even as she's critiquing racism, she's also participating in that larger project of imperialism. So I think it complicates how we think about African Americans in relationship to colonization. And for Nancy Prince, what we learn is that not all African Americans found home abroad. The thinking was that if we go to another country, we'll find a place where we have more freedom. And she discovered that that's not the case, and that we need to stay focused on attaining our full freedoms here in America.
Because even many who went to Liberia actually came back because
That's
they
right.
didn't find.
That's right.
I wouldn't say necessarily the freedom, but the kind of society that they were searching.
That's right.
Now, as an English professor, we're talking about someone like Nancy Prince who wrote an autobiography, and there have been other African American women who have written autobiographies. Do you find that that the narrative in those autobiographies are different from other autobiographies of their times, and if so, how?
Well, in Nancy Prince's case, it's very different, and it makes it very difficult to read because she's in so many different genres. It's not a strict autobiography. It's also a travel narrative. It's a spiritual narrative. In some ways, it feels like a slave narrative, and so it's working in multiple genres in that way. And she also switches voice on us in her narrative, too, which is something I talk about in my writing that I think is really interesting. She doesn't give you that straightforward I perspective that you would expect in an autobiography.
Do you find them to be writing from the inside out, that is giving the reader a real sense of how they felt, or is it more an observer's perspective, so someone narrating the facts as they happen?
That's a really great question for these women, because one of the challenges they faced is, how do I speak to a white audience who has these assumptions about me that I'm not fully human, and how can I be honest and really reveal everything about myself to this kind of audience that could often be hostile. And so they masked a lot, they shielded a lot, and there are a lot of silences in their texts because of that. And so we see that tension in Nancy Prince's narrative, for instance. She's very objective at times and tries to displace herself from the center of her narrative, and then there are other places where she gets pulled back in. So it's interesting to study those tensions.
Okay. Now, before we began the show, you told me that you were teaching this semester autobiographies.
Yes.
And there will be people who will be thinking, oh, I may want to write one. And something that I have seen the last few years is that you don't have to be a famous person to write an autobiography. In fact, the genre is being called now memoirs. And I was wondering, what would be your advice for people who want to write their autobiography? What would be the best way to convey your story?
Well, there's definitely no one right way to do it. That's one of the things I've learned from reading a lot of autobiographies. I have been shaped a lot by bell hooks, so I actually had my students read today to think about what makes good autobiography, as opposed to just me writing about everything that I'm going through. And what she argues is that strong autobiographical writing confronts the self and makes a discovery that you didn't know before, and shows a transformation and process of growth over time. So I would say that if this is something you're interested in, then that's the kind of writing you should reach for, is the writing that's transformative, that enables you and the reader to discover something new.
Okay. So the question is, of course, when you write your autobiography, you are relying on your memory, which is obviously colored by your own biases, your experiences, and maybe your own agenda when you write your autobiographies too. So to what extent can you tell that an autobiography is really true, is really sincere in what the author is expressing?
Well, I think every autobiography is a construction of the self, a particular construction of the self, and I think that's why we see writers returning to their story again and again and again and rewriting it, and it changes each time. I don't think there's just one self. There's the self that we choose to present at this particular moment, and that is shaped by your audience and your intent, your motivation. And, I think that's fine for me, rather than being concerned with the actual literal fact or truth of what happened is what the truth of what you can learn from that experience. And so that, for me, that kind of truth is more important than whether or not there are elements that have been fictionalized or in that way. So for me, in our class, we read fictional autobiographies, and we read autobiographical novels and cross genres like that.
Okay. What is the best autobiography that you have ever read?
The best autobiography. That's really, really hard to choose. I think one that I return to again and again and again is Harriet Jacobs. And she's another 19th century writer. And I think, to me, she is really the first African-American woman to push the boundaries in terms of her autobiography and talk about those things that we see silenced in all of the other autobiographies, like rape, for instance. And she gives voice to it in her narrative, which I just find, really encouraging, and taking such tremendous courage to say that in her particular context.
Do you have the chance to read the autobiographical books by Barack Obama?
I have not read those.
Okay, because I was wondering.
But I've read about them.
Okay, yeah, because I found that essentially it was a journey of discovery of himself, and because of his complicated ethnic background, obviously, but also, I think he was pretty sincere in terms of his past drug use, for example. But then some people may think, well, this was a good move for him to come clean, so to speak, and so wouldn't damage his political career later on. And there's always this question is, when someone writes his or her autobiography, to what extent you have some ulterior motivation thinking of your career, especially when you write it so young. So is there a good age to write your autobiography?
Well, I don't know if there's an ideal age for it. I definitely think that there's always a motivation and ulterior motive for writing the autobiography, and I can definitely see why he would want to put all of that out there, because when you're writing your own narrative, you get to structure it and shape it, and shape how you come out and how you look. So I can imagine that would be advantageous for him.
Okay. Now, going back to African American women, you are also working on Toni Morrison, and that's a much better known author. Tell us about what are you working on that particular topic.
In our class, we're actually exploring the spiritual elements in her novels, and today we specifically talked about goodness. She gave a lecture at Harvard Divinity School in 2012 where she talked about goodness in literature and how it's been treated historically and how she sees it treated now and how she deals with it in her work. And she sees it as central to her writing.
I don't know if you know this, but she was here on campus 3 years ago.
Was she? I was wondering that.
Yes.
A student actually asked me that today, if she had been here.
And I got to meet her. At the beginning, I saw, well, because she's rather old now. And I said, well, this is kind of a frail person because she was sitting when she was greeting people. But then when she took the podium, I would say she almost transformed herself. And I think she was very conscious that she was performing in certain ways, and saying this in a very positive way. And it's that sense of authenticity that you get when she is doing that. Which is funny because sometimes you say people look more authentic when they are in private, in smaller settings, than when they're in public. And I got the opposite impression from her, that the person that you saw on stage was the real person. And I don't know if that has to do with the fact that there are people who actually are more shy when they are in smaller settings than when they are in public settings. But anyhow, so is being shy a problem when you write your autobiography?
Well, I've actually had this conversation today with my students, and we've got different views on it. I think that it can be difficult. One of the things Bell Hooks says when she started writing her first autobiography is after she wrote it, she was so ashamed at the idea of sharing that with others that she just threw it away. And I think so that, if you have to have a lot of willingness to put yourself out there if you're going to publish an autobiography. But at the same time, my students helped me to see today that it can actually be easier to reveal something about yourself to strangers than it is to share it with people you know. And so that sort of gets back to what you're saying about Morrison and seeming a little bit more intimate look at who she is when she's giving her public performance. And I think there's a way that distance enables you to reveal something that is harder when you are closer to someone.
Okay. Well, we have been talking about a particular genre within the African American literature, which is biography. But I was wondering, in general, where do you think that African American literature is moving these days, and what direction?
Well, my area of focus is 19th century, so I don't know if I'm the best person to answer where it's going. But one of the interesting trends that I see is that there's this returned interest to the past. So it's this idea that just because we're in the 21st century doesn't mean that we are done with where we've been. There's always this idea that we're connected to what has come before. So when I do deal with 20th century text, it's often to show students the continuities between the old and the new, and the fact that writers are returning to the same themes, like slavery, for instance, and themes of searching for home and the theme of memory again and again. So similar themes in new contexts.
I think that's quite interesting because you can find a lot of parallelism between things that are happening today with things that happened in the past, only that we do not discover them. We, for example, a lot of people are talking about the MOOCs, the famous lectures, but decades ago there were records, for people who remember what a record was, that contained classes. People think about emails, but then they forget there was something called a telegram, and things of that nature. So I was wondering if you have seen same kind of themes being repeated through times in the autobiographies that you have studied.
I have, absolutely. And one of them I mentioned was this idea of home and this search for a home. And one of the interesting things I discovered, I was reading a contemporary autobiography called Lose Your Mother, and that's by Saida Hartman, who's a professor. But she travels back to Africa, and so similarly to the women that I'm writing about in the 19th century, she's doing this similar return in search of home. And makes a similar discovery, actually, as Amanda Smith, that Africa does not offer us home. And so I find that really interesting that you can see this text written in 1893 and this other text that's written, in the 21st century. I believe it came out in, I think it's 2011. But talking pretty much the same way, the search for home and not finding it in this place where they expect to find it.
You have mentioned several times about the classes that you teach that have to do with African American literature and all that. And a lot of people have this misconception that the only people who attend those classes are African Americans, but that's not true,
Not true.
So I was wondering, what is the reaction of your students, whether blacks or whites, when they start to learn about this particular narrative, about these particular experiences, from times that they never live, and they probably have a hard time comprehending.
It is a challenge. I think there's a challenge for all of the students because of the distance in time. And I try to help with that by bringing in a lot of resources to help them enter into the 18th and the 19th centuries. And they are very open to it and really engage well, I feel like, with those earlier centuries. And they discover, at least what they tell me, is that despite whatever differences there are, they could be distances of historical time period, distances of gender or race or religion, there is a fundamental human connection that they're able to make with the writers, and especially with autobiography, because it is personal writing, it's easier to make that connection. And they all sort of take something away from the text, regardless of what differences exist.
And how about the connections between African American literature and religion?
Yeah, I think a lot of students are surprised to see just how much it shapes the tradition and the canon of literature. But they also see a lot of connections that I didn't even think of. That it really does infuse the language, it infuses the themes, the references. But they, the students I found have been very open to those connections here and exploring those with me.
Okay. Do you feel that going through academic experiences like this, somehow we are contributing to develop the so-called post-racial society?
Well, I'm not convinced that post-racial society exists yet. I think what's happening in my classes, at least, is students are beginning to think seriously and critically about their particular social location and what that means and how that shapes their reading of the text, and how to enter into conversation with people from other social locations despite that difference, but not ignoring that difference either, because it shapes how we see the world.
Yeah, I agree with you, because despite the election and re-election of Barack Obama, we are far from talking about a post-racial society.
That's right.
We may mask some of the problems, but the problems, no question,
are still there, yes.
Yeah. Now, I wanted to ask you as a last question, we have about 60 seconds for that, is tell us about your next big project, the next big thing you really want to work on.
I am really excited to talk about ships because sort of what comes along with studying women who travel is how they get around, and that's on ships. And so I'm very interested in how ships function in the Atlantic world in the 19th century. And there are many scholars who've studied ships, of course, Paul Gilroy and also Catherine McKittrick, who I use in my writing. But I'd like to think about how ships function within a Christian context as well, because that's shaping people's experience in the 19th century of ships as well, and what's the relationship between the ship as a spiritual metaphor, but also as a slave ship. So that's where I'm headed next.
I'm sure you will find a lot of interesting material, particularly when it comes to whaling ships.
Yes.
Because there was also a racial component there that was quite interesting. We can talk more about that, because that's something which I have written myself. Okay, well, thank you very much to Dr. Trisha Brooks for this interesting interview. And next week, don't miss another exciting episode of Segway. So stay tuned.
This has been Segway with Dean Aldemaro Romero, a production of the Department of Mass Communications at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. All rights reserved, 2014.